Okay, welcome back Science 30s to our next lesson in chapter 4. This is 4.5 and today we're talking about sex-linked traits and pedigrees. Okay, so in today's lesson we're going to talk about autosomal versus sex-linked traits. What the difference between these are is an autosomal trait is a trait that has its genotype or the gene on the first 1 to 22 chromosomes, most of the chromosomes. And the difference between this and our other type, our sex-linked traits, is if we have that genetic code for a gene on the X or the Y. And this will affect the probability in males and females because a male has an X and a Y and a female has two X's. Okay, so if that trait is on an X, there's going to be two X's in females, so that's going to affect those probabilities. If it's on a X, there's only one X in males, that will also affect the probability. And if it's on a Y, that can only be had by males since females don't have a Y chromosome. We'll look at all that in a little bit more detail, but just knowing that 1 to 22 is autosomal. If it's on the X or Y, and that's the gene and trait that we're looking at, then it's considered to be sex-linked. Okay, so let's start by looking at genes that are X-linked traits, and this means they are on the X chromosome. These could be dominant or recessive because in females we have two X's. So if you had a dominant one, it would dominate the other X. If you had a recessive one, it would be hidden by the other X. If it's recessive, it is going to be more common in males, and if it's X dominant, it's going to be more common in females. Let's take a look at why that is. And I kind of like to use the analogy of rolling dice, okay? Because again, the female has two X's and the male has an X and a Y. So the opportunity for them to have this trait is different for the females and the males. It's like the females have two rolls of the dice to see if they're going to get this one, and the males have one roll of the dice to see if they're going to get it. And to see how that makes it more probable for dominant in females and more probable for males in recessive sex-linked traits on the X chromosome, let's imagine that these were actually rolling dice, okay? So let's say that recessive trait is if you roll a 5 on this dice. So we have a male and we have a female, and if they roll a 5, they're going to have that trait. And the male gets one roll at the dice and they roll it and they see what it lands on, and it lands on a 5. That means they're gonna have that trait. They had, with the dice, a 1 in 6 chance, and they hit that percentage and got the trait. Now when the female goes, she'll roll it as well, and she rolls it and turns out she gets a 5 as well. And I did that to say that they have an equal probability of rolling a 5 when they roll their first dice. But the female has a second roll because she doesn't have just one X chromosome, she has another one. So if she rolls a second one and say rolls a 4, that 4 we're going to say represents not having the trait. And if she rolled both of those, a 5 and a 4, and the trait 5 is recessive, the 4 is going to overpower it and she's not going to have the trait. So kind of think of if you were rolling a dice and 5 was bad, the male rolls it and he has that 1 in 6 chance of getting it. The female rolls her first dice, has the same odds, but then she gets to roll again, and if she doesn't get a 5, that's going to wipe out her first roll. So it's kind of like having two chances there, and it takes the one that is dominant or that is not a 5. Hopefully that analogy kind of makes sense for you. Now, same analogy, we're going to use a dominant example now and show why that is more common in females. So let's say if you roll a 4, you get this trait, and that trait is dominant. Okay, so the male rolls the dice, and let's say he doesn't roll a 4, he rolls a 3. So it's like, okay, you had a 5 in 6 chance that you weren't going to get that trait, and it looks like you're not going to. Then the female again rolls the first dice and ends up rolling a 1. So it's okay, you didn't roll a 4 either, so you're not going to get the trait. But before we just finish things there, she gets a second roll. And if she rolls on the second one, which does roll a 4, and the 4 is dominant, it's going to overpower that one, and she will have the trait. So that second roll could be another opportunity to get the trait. Again, it's just an analogy. There's no actually rolling of dice, but hopefully it kind of makes sense with how the probability will be affected by having two X chromosomes compared to having one. Okay, now let's look at Y-linked traits. This is actually a little easier to understand. Only males can have this, because reminder, XX for female, XY for male. So females simply don't have a Y chromosome. So if there's a trait that only comes on Y chromosomes, females can't have it. And all the males must get it from their dad, because they don't get a Y chromosome from their mom. Their mom doesn't have a Y. So all males would get it from their dad. So just to show this with a little animation here, the mom and dad, the mom has two X's and the dad has an XY. And if the dad gives away his X and the mom has to give away an X because that's all she has, then that would create a female with two X's over here. But if the dad does give away his Y, and again, the female has to give away an X, then those are going to go over to that side. We have an XY, which is a male. So male over there and female over here. The son must have got his Y from the dad. Okay, so now we know a little bit about the difference between autosomal and sex-linked, and now we're going to look at how to kind of track how a trait is going to change through generations in something called a pedigree. So we have some symbols that we have to know what they mean first. If we have shaded symbols, we're going to have circles and rectangles or squares, and if they're shaded in, that means they're affected or have the trait. If we have a square, that means it's a male. If it's a circle, it means it's a female. And these ones are not shaded, so that would show not being affected or not having the trait. If we show a square and a circle and a line connecting them, that means that they are mating, and then we're going to have another line to show the offspring. So we draw a line going down to whatever type of offspring they had. In this case, a circle that is not shaded in, so that would be a non-affected female offspring. Okay, now I'll step out of the way here so we can see an example of a pedigree. This shows that we have 3 generations. We start up at the top with an unaffected male who mates with an affected female, and then we can see the lines going down to their children, and then we have connecting lines with who their mates were as well, and then this continues down to another generation. So the generations are shown on the side here with 1 at the top, 2 in the middle, and 3 in the bottom. And generation 1 is those 2, generation 3 is those, and sorry, generation 2 is those in red, and generation 3 is there in yellow. So questions involving pedigrees give you a picture like this, and it may ask you questions about sex-linked and dominant, and questions about how the trait is moving and its characteristics. So they can be a little bit tricky to interpret, so I'm going to show some examples of things to look for or questions to ask as you go through the pedigree. So first question it might ask is the trait dominant or recessive? Okay, so we have to figure out based off that picture if that trait, so we can see those that have it are shaded in gray, those that don't have it are left white or blank. So a good thing to ask or good thing to look for is look for if we have the same phenotype parents having an offspring with a different phenotype. So if the parents don't have the trait, both of them don't, can they have a child who does have it? Or if the parents both have a trait, can they have a child that doesn't have it? And we see this actually right in the first generation. There are 2 non-affected parents here, the male and the female, and they have 2 affected kids. So we're going to see if that would make sense if the trait is dominant or recessive, and we're just going to try both. So let's first say that what if affected is dominant? That would mean that that female offspring has to have at least 1 dominant allele. So I put the capital B there to show dominant. The other one doesn't matter. If it's another dominant, that's fine. It would show dominant. And if it's a recessive, this dominant would overpower it and it would show dominant. So it just has to have at least 1. Okay? So if shaded in or affected is dominant, what would the parents be? Well, they aren't shaded in, so they must be recessive, meaning that they both would have 2 recessive alleles. So does it make sense that if they both had recessive ones that they could give rise to an offspring who had a capital or had a dominant? Doesn't look like it. There's nowhere to get that capital B from. So this way would not make sense. So now let's try the other way, saying that having the trait or being affected is recessive. That means you would need 2 recessive alleles, because if you had 1 dominant, that one would show. So if we're saying affected is recessive, you would need 2 recessive. Okay? So that would mean that the parents, because they're showing a different phenotype, that they must have at least 1 of the dominant. So we have a capital, and then it doesn't matter what the other one was. If it's another dominant, then it's going to be dominant. If it's recessive, it would dominate it. So that would be fine too. Well, you must know that each of the parent has 1 dominant. Is it possible for them to give rise to a child with two recessive? It is, as long as the other two alleles that they have are recessive. Then they could give their recessive alleles to their offspring, and then the offspring would have that recessive phenotype. So I know that's a lot to think about and a lot to sort through, but again, look for when you have the parents as a different phenotype than the offspring, and just look at which one makes more sense. Now, another type of question that it could ask is it could ask for the genotype of a specific person on that pedigree. So for example, what is the genotype of the male in generation 3? So I look at the bottom, which is generation 3, and see that there's only one male on that far side, and that male is not affected or does not have the trait. Now, it helps that we already determined that the trait was recessive, because now we can kind of trace back what the genotype must be. We already said that these must be heterozygous parents off the very start in generation 1. And then they would have to give each of their recessive alleles to the next generation if they're going to have the trait, because we said the trait is recessive. So if that male or that dad would have two recessive, and the mom in that case is not showing the trait, she must have at least one dominant. Okay, so then for the kid to be dominant, he got a recessive from the dad and got a dominant from the mom, and is showing the dominant allele of not being affected. So must have got a lowercase b from dad, that's all he had, but because he's not showing the trait and not having two small b's just like him, must have got a capital B from the mom. So we know the genotype would be capital and lowercase, which means heterozygous. Okay, so now we've looked at dominant and recessive. Now let's look to see if this is sex-linked. So first we'll consider if it's Y-linked. This is kind of an easier one to determine, because the question you can ask is, do all of the dads that are affected give it to their son? And the answer in this case is no. We just saw an example over there with a affected square that did not give it to the square in the next generation, or the son in the next generation. And we know that that son in the next generation has a Y from the dad. Can't get a Y from mom because mom has two X's. So if that Y was the thing that was affected, the kid would definitely have it. But he doesn't, so it must not be Y-linked. All dads have to give it to all sons if it is. All right, and we see right there that a dad did not give the trait to his son. And now a little bit more difficult, the X-linked traits, but again, it helps that we've already determined that this is recessive. Okay, so if recessive in a female is being shown, it must have got that trait from its dad. Okay, so if we look down here, right, we have two lowercase b's, which represents someone who has and is showing that recessive trait. We already determined it's recessive, so needs two lowercase. So that means must have got a lowercase from mom and must have got a lowercase from dad. But now we think about, could we've got a lowercase from dad? If so, then that would be his only X chromosome, because he's an X and a Y. So if his X was lowercase and recessive, he would show that trait. So let's show that with mom. Must have had one that we got that one from mom, and dad must have had one too. But he only had one shot, one roll of the dice. So if he had that lowercase b, he should be showing it. But we see that the parents in this case are not both showing it. So this tells us that it is not X-linked recessive. It's just recessive, but not linked to that X chromosome. Now, if you had a case where you knew that the trait was dominant, that could have got the dominant one from their mom or their dad, didn't need it from both. So that gets a little bit trickier, but that usually shows up that it's more common in the females, which is something we also don't see here, but we knew that it was recessive before we began looking to see if it was X related. Okay, and that's it for today's video. I know that was probably pretty complex and kind of hard to sort through, so kind of go back and with those and look at the rules and look at those questions to see if you can sort them out. Make sure you ask me any questions you have in the live time. I'll do my best to help you out. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.